This is a McKillop podcast. Welcome to exploring curiosity, resiliency, and hope. A podcast for times of challenge and transformation. We are excited for your presence as we learn, grow, and evolve from a multitude of voices and wisdom. This is a space for conversations and curiosity, finding ways to be resilient with all that is happening in our personal lives and the world, and maybe finding an embodied hope to live by. We join our host, Trevor, in conversation with Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock, who is currently the Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Programs at Volunteers of America. Dr. Brock is a leading expert on moral injury, which is the internal crisis and suffering that results when one sees or does something that goes against one's own moral code. She has personally experienced the devastating and life-altering effects of moral injury after her father returned from the Vietnam War. She believes that moral injury is part of many of our lives as we navigate what faces us: the pandemic, climate change, violence, racism, war, or intergenerational trauma.
As soon as I hit college, civil rights work erupted, and that led to anti-war work. And so I became a political activist in college, and that informed my entire career as a theologian. I have been interested in the question of the forces that cause human suffering since I entered college. And racism was one of those, and war was another, and sexism all these things kept getting added to my list of ways that people live in systems that harm them.
Dr. Brock was raised in a military family and was the first Asian American woman to earn a doctorate in theology. Rita was director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University, a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School Center for Values in Public Life, and a visiting scholar at the Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California. In 2012, she co-founded the Soul Repair Center with Colonel Chaplain Herman Kaiser Jr., U.S. Army veteran, and directed it until May 2017. Her most recent book is Soul Repair: Recovering from Moral Injury After War, co-authored with Gabriella Latini, the first book written on moral injury. You can learn about Dr. Brock and her work with the Volunteers of America and their unique moral injury initiatives and the work they do at www.voa.org/moral injury.
It's such a privilege to have you on the show today, Rita, to discuss moral distress and moral injury and to hear your wisdom and how we work with these things. And so welcome to the program. And what would you like for us to know about you as we begin this conversation?
I think it's important to know that I am a product of multiple cultures. I started the first part of my life as a child in a Buddhist family in Japan, a Japanese Buddhist family. My stepfather was from rural Mississippi. He's the father I grew up with. My mother married when I was 2.5. And he became a major factor in my life when I was 5. And we transitioned to a military base where I switched from Japanese into English. And I didn't retain the Japanese. My mother didn't encourage it. There were all kinds of reasons for that, I think, that were her commitment to making sure I had a successful start in the United States as a child growing up in the United States. So that was a dramatic loss and shift in my life between the ages of 5 and 6 when I did that transition. And then I was raised in a military family until I went to college. So, and my stepfather was a combat veteran, first of World War II and before he met my mother. And then later on, when I was in high school, he went to Vietnam on 2 tours. So my concern for moral injury in military veterans really originates in my own family background. My father was very different when he came back from Vietnam, and we were estranged until he died 8 years after he came home. So that's affected my life. It's meant a major disruption in my relationship to my family right at the time I set off for college. But also growing up in a military family meant I grew up in an integrated military. So I didn't have that experience of segregation in the 50s and 60s that affected a lot of people. And I spent 3 years in Germany. So I also have education that, including in German language, we were in a in a German area on a military base, and an interest in European history and European music and all kinds of things I was exposed to in junior high and early high school. And that's just, I'm not that different from other military brats, is what we're called. Our experience of growing up American is actually quite different from people who, were born and lived in the same town until they went off to college or got jobs and moved other places. I talked to a person one time who'd been in 12 different schools by the time he was in 6th grade.
Wow.
And his was a fairly extreme example, but I also experienced moving from Fort Riley, Kansas to Landstuhl, Germany to Barstow, California as part of my upbringing. And when people ask a military brat, where are you from? It's a puzzling question. And I usually have to say, well, do you want to know where I was born or where I live now? And there isn't a place in between there from where I was born and where I live now that is a place that I would call home.
It reminds me of PKs, pastor kids.
That's same, another, or diplomat kids.
Yeah, that's right.
Missionary kids. We're all, there actually have been parallels drawn around that because so many families make a lot of decisions related to the well-being of their children, and they will, refuse a promotion because it means kids have to change school at the wrong time, and so the children are a major focus of the family's life. In a military family, the person in the military's job is the focus, and you have to go. You don't have a choice. And so the way the families orient is often a little different in terms of what's valued for the welfare of the children.
So part of your personal experience with the military and your father led you to get to a moral injury, or was there a route in between? Where is in between where you are now?
A lot of in between,
curious.
Actually. If you'd have told me when I started graduate school that I would end up my life working with military veterans and talking to generals in the Pentagon and really feeling like this was powerful and meaningful work, I would have just thought you were from Mars or something. It was like inconceivable to me because I entered college an anti-war activist. And I don't know that that was informed directly by my experience with my father. It's just that was my generation. And as soon as I hit college, civil rights work erupted, and that led to anti-war work. And so I became a political activist in college, and that informed my entire career as a theologian. I have been interested in the question of the forces that cause human suffering since I entered college. And racism was one of those, and war was another, and sexism, all these things kept getting added to my list of ways that people live in systems that harm them.
So you ended up in theological school. So you went from Buddhism to Christianity, if I hear you right.
Yeah, in an odd way. Christianity, growing up in military-based Protestantism, I had an understanding of the Bible. I actually read it when I was from cover to cover when I was about 10 or 12, because Sunday school teachers said you should do that. And I learned a lot in Sunday school about Jesus and, the Gospels and things. But it didn't make a lot of what I would call emotional sense to me. It felt a little alien. Jesus seemed a little bit like a rude person if you're Japanese, the way he
Oh.
speaks so bluntly, and all
Mhm.
of that didn't seem that appealing to me. But I when in high school, as my dad was in Vietnam, a Baptist fundamentalist Baptist minister's daughter became a good friend in high school, and I wound up going to the church, and he was just a very good minister.
Hmm.
And he kind of looked after my mom and looked after us without us even thinking about that's what he was doing while my
Mhm.
dad was gone. And so I actually chose to be baptized so I could be a member of his church and not an outsider. So I made a confession of faith that was linguistically what I was supposed to say, but I don't know that I felt it.
Yeah.
And so I would say that I became a Christian in my biblical classes in college. My first class was in literature of the Old Testament, and that's where I learned that Jesus belonged to a very long legacy of people struggling for justice.
Hmm.
And my own activism and that
Mhm.
lineage connected in college for me, and I finally understood, I thought, who Jesus was. And then I thought, I could belong to a tradition like this.
Ah.
And so that's how I became part of the Christian tradition, and then that's why I got really interested in, biblical studies,
Mhm.
and then and I actually could read biblical Hebrew in college as I took an independent study in
Yeah.
Hebrew. I was that interested in the Bible,
Yes.
and in biblical literature, and in just religious literature in general, and I theology, philosophy, all that stuff in college. But then feminism arrived at the end of my senior year in my life, and all of that looked pretty awful. It was suddenly
Yes.
very male dominated,
Yep.
very, Western orient all of these things, and so, um, and you'd think that and this is something I learned in my class, you'd think that if you expose people to the problems and, like these
Mhm.
issues of oppression built into a system you thought you were gonna be part of that was really appealing to you,
Yes.
and you had to pull back, that it would make you wanna leave
Hmm.
and give up. And what I
Mhm.
found is instead, people want to engage with those questions to see if they can be fixed.
Hmm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I would introduce in my when I was as a grad student teaching Bible classes at my alma mater, I would I would early in the semester just lay down those Deuteronomy texts about rape, which makes it, it mandated that a woman has to marry her rapist
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
one of the examples,
Yeah.
and which would be shocking, shocking to people
Yeah.
that that's in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
But it would make the women want to figure this out. They would get more engaged with the material because they had an emotional investment in
Mm.
understanding
Mhm.
it and how to deconstruct it. And that's what
Yeah.
happened to me.
Yeah.
And so the more I got into the not the biblical questions, but the theological questions about
Yeah.
the sanctity of masculinity in the
Mhm.
Father God and in Jesus as a savior and all of those things, um, uh, uh, I'll tell you the story of how this mattered to me. In
Yes.
graduate school, I didn't wanna deal with all those questions, so I decided I was gonna do interfaith dialogue because that was
Mm.
also part of my family background as I had
Yeah.
a Buddhist family and a Christian family, and I didn't believe in missions. I didn't think my Japanese family needed Christianity, so how was I
Mhm.
gonna put those 2 parts of myself together? So I did all of my coursework thinking that would be my dissertation,
Oh, wow.
including studying some Japanese language and all of that.
Yeah.
And then I had I think the second year of my graduate work, I had a course on Christology
Mhm.
from this amazing professor who'd been the dean at University of Chicago Divinity School, Bernard Loomer.
Hmm.
And the whole way through it, I was so upset about the patriarchy in
Mm.
Christology, all of this God, this, Jesus as God, this male person, and
Mhm.
even though that was especially in Protestantism, subdued, because it was not
Yeah.
Protestant did ordain women, but
Yep.
it was still a huge problem. So I wound up writing a pretty angry end of the semester paper about the fact that that was all we had looked at, was all of
Hmm.
these white men talking about Jesus. There was not a feminist text, not even a liberation or a person
Yep.
of color text assigned in that course. And And so I turned the paper in late because I got an extension because I was too angry to write a paper for a while, and I had to digest some of it. So I turned in this 25-page kind of rant, feminist rant, and the
Mm-hmm.
professor made a 2-hour appointment to talk to me about my paper. I thought I flunked the class. And instead, he walked me through my paper page by page, and he'd given me an A on it.
Wow.
And then he looked at me and said, "You need to write your dissertation on this topic."
Mm.
And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you have a deep emotional investment in this topic,
Mm.
and you will see it through to the end." I said, "Yeah, but everybody's telling me," this is like 1979.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
he's saying to me, I said, "Everybody says if you do a feminist dissertation, you won't get a job."
Mm.
And he said, "It doesn't matter." He said, "Because you have things that you're saying things that no one has said before.
Mm.
And you have enough of an emotional investment in this topic that you will finish your other topic. You'll get bored and leave.
Oh.
You won't finish." He just said that flat out.
Yeah.
How did he know that? Of course, he was retired and taught a lot of students, so he had some idea. So I said, "I'll think about it."
Mm.
And I thought about it for an entire year before I changed topics. So I did all my coursework outside the area I wound up working
Yeah.
on, or not focused on the area I wound up working on.
Yeah.
So it took me an extra year to write a dissertation proposal, but I wound up writing on Christology
Wow.
because he was right. I had to
Wow.
figure out and the question I had to figure out in grad school was whether it was possible to be a feminist and a Christian at the same time.
Hmm. And looking back as we're meandering our way
Yeah.
to it, is do you think there was some degree of moral injury in some of that work? Or if you didn't look at it, would there be moral distress or
Yeah. It would be morally incomprehensible to have remained a Christian and a feminist at the same time if I hadn't figured out a way to find my way to a solution to that dilemma. And actually, trauma was my way into the figuring it out. That what I actually wrote my doctoral thesis on how certain forms of Christian theology echo what abused children say about their parents, and how destructive that was.
Yeah.
And how there is another way to think about Jesus and God that don't reinscribe child abuse. So already in my doctoral thesis, human suffering and forms of human suffering were the lens at which I looked at theological questions and answers. So now looking back, I think, well, it's sort of logical. I would have wound back up at moral injury,
Yeah.
because it's I think an ancient form of suffering.
Well, even in one of your books I call seminal, Saving Paradise, you're really looking at that topic in another lens around. It's a big word for people that don't say, substitution atonement theology and the trauma and violence around that theology too.
Yeah. And Rebecca Parker and I both, in an earlier book called Proverbs of Ashes, described our own journeys to a critique of that theology.
Yeah.
Her from having deeply imbued it as a child of a Methodist family, that suffering makes you closer to Jesus, and you shouldn't burden other people with your suffering, that you should be strong enough to bear their suffering without imposing yours on them. And so she was unable as a child to express it. She had been sexually abused by a neighbor when she was 4 and lived with that until she was 36 and finally got into therapy. And that story is her being freed from that burden of that theology. So, after years as a minister, even.
Yeah.
And in my case, it was not having been fed that theology for most of my life and finding it odd and hard. It was incomprehensible to me. It wasn't that I hadn't had experiences of suffering as a child, but I had had a pretty safe and beloved family in Japan. I mean, I had the value of feeling deeply loved and valued as a child and not having been abused. I have no recollection at all of any kind of abuse.
Yeah.
So that I have that, and so the theology just didn't make a lot of sense to me. But I also, knew it was sort of like the only way you could be Christian was to believe that Jesus had died for your sins because you were too sinful to save yourself.
Yeah.
And I remember in 6th grade, I was at a revival thing, and this preacher was going on and on about getting saved because you're going to go to hell and all. And we were supposed to close our eyes and raise our hand if we wanted to be saved. And I, as a Japanese person, was not going to ever walk up and make an emotional spectacle of myself in front of a bunch of people. But, closed eyes, raise hand. I thought, this is my chance to get saved. This is my chance to get saved without having to do that. Yeah. And I sat there with my eyes closed, and I thought to myself, I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad. So I refused to raise my hand, and he went on and on. I thought, I'm the only person without my hand raised. We're going to be here all night. But he quit after a while. And then he had us open our eyes. And then he had everybody who raised their hand to go forward. And I thought, oh, it was a trick. And then only a handful of people walked forward. So I thought, oh, okay. I didn't have to raise my hand. Yeah. And I've just always had that resistance to this idea that I was so bad that this horrible thing had to be done on my behalf. So Rebecca and I come at the question from different life experiences, but we settled on this sense of how damaging that theology is in a lot of ways. One is the idea that children are born needing to be disciplined and fixed. Yes. Rather than being blessed with a love that helps them flourish and blossom as their true selves. And, but also the idea that then as an adult, suffering makes you closer to Jesus. That there's something sanctifying about suffering rather than just it being part of life. And that you get through not because you're holy because you suffer, but because there's something else in you that loves the world. That there's a part, that you endure the suffering because of love for the world and others, not because the suffering is what sanctifies you.
What is moral injury? According to Dr. Brock and the Volunteers of America Shea Moral Injury Center, moral injury is the suffering people experience when we are in high-stakes situations, things go wrong, and harm results that challenges our deepest moral codes and ability to trust in others or ourselves. The harm may be something we did, something we witnessed, or something that was done to us. It results in moral emotions such as shame, guilt, self-condemnation, outrage, and sorrow. People may also do things to survive that violate their conscience and believe they are no longer good. What are the symptoms of moral injury? People will often feel grief, as well as guilt, remorse, shame, outrage, and despair. They lose trust in themselves and their moral foundations. Their relationships may be disrupted because they cannot trust others not to judge them. And they self-isolate. They may mask their inner pain with alcohol or drugs. They can become alienated from societal norms and lash out in anger at the slightest provocation.
Can you help us sort of like a few definitions? Like what is moral injury as we sort of skirt around it?
Yeah.
And how is it different like some mental health categories like PSTD and other things like that?
It's okay. I don't consider moral injury a mental health problem, although I think mental health services can be helpful. So I don't think it's a either or. And in fact, I think the whole tendency to fight domains and do either or thinking is a problem for moral injury because I think it's much more comprehensive. a kind of suffering that goes at the core of a human person's identity. And we all need some kind of moral identity to function in relationships. And that comes from our core need for love. And it's, there's plenty of evidence that you can feed and keep a child clean and healthy. And if it doesn't have love, it will die. That emotional neglect is a form of abuse because it's like withholding food. It's essential for it's essential for life, and that need in human beings, I think, is the core of our being moral, born moral. Is that need for love, and the way we maintain relationships in all of our dimensions of life is by being a good person. It's sometimes trivialized as being polite or having good manners. But
that's very much Canada. Canadians say sorry a lot.
But that is how one signals that one is a moral person, right? It's simple signaling, but it's important signaling. And, if you're in another culture and people don't do that signaling in the same way, you can feel really weird, or they can regard you as odd, a little off, right? So it's, and that little offness has a moral quality to it, right? It's a judgment. And so it's so imbued in human societies that we don't even think about how important morality is and our conscience and being moral. So when you are in a situation where that capacity, your capacity to know what to do, isn't clear or is taken away from you because the situation is so devastating, there's no good choice possible. Doing something horrible, it affects everything about you because it's at the core of your identity that you have done some kind of violation. And it can be because of something that was done to you that you were helpless to prevent. So you can, that's Jonathan Shea's definition, is that moral injury is the violation of what's right by someone with power and authority in a high stakes situation. And you are betrayed by that person. And that, I think, explains a lot of child abuse and sexual that you that somebody with more power than you that should have been the person who took care of you, or at least should have been moral, and you're damaged by some people feel contaminated, or you did things to survive that you're ashamed of. Right? So all of those factors strike at the core of your very being. And it's your physical being, it's your emotional being, it's your mental being, it's your spiritual being. All of that, that's moral injury. And it can also be something you did, right? Like you did something, like you had to lie a lot to survive, or in a case of a veteran, you killed someone and now you're living with that. Or you just witnessed something. You could be, for example, in a family where you witness physical abuse of a parent. Right? And you can't stop it. You feel there's a moral judgment against yourself also, and not just the abuser. So it can be something you witnessed, something you failed to prevent. Those all can be so devastating to your core sense of being a good person who can function in the world. It can break that core self because the morality you thought you knew and could function by no longer works.
Oh, wow.
So your whole global system of being a self in the world is disrupted.
That's pretty profound, isn't it?
It's devastating. People take their own lives because of it. They can't find a way to live anymore and make meaning.
So, for example, in the veteran population, both Canada, United States, there seems to be higher suicide rate than the baseline population. And is that part of the reason why?
Yeah. In the United States, I've just been looking at these numbers. In the United States, in the last 20 years, we've had the longest wars in our history. Both wars did not end well. And so there have been 7,000 casualties, a little over 7,000 casualties, and not casualties, deaths. I'm going to make that distinction. A casualty is somebody wounded or dead. There have been 7,000 people who were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan that were in the U.S. military or contractors employed by the military. There have been a little over 30,000 suicides in the same period of time in veterans of that generation of wars.
Yeah.
So that dwarfs the kill rate by a lot.
It does.
And then there are 1.8 million veterans with disabilities. And that can be a mental disability like PTSD, which is a kind of disorder where your brain fear system is malfunctioning, and there are good therapies for it.
Yeah.
And they get better and better. It can be because you had a psychotic break because of what happened to you. Yeah. Or it can be you feel like a miserable human being or contaminated by evil, which would be moral injury.
Yeah.
And all of those are effects of a devastating thing like war.
Yeah. You know, and in Canada right now, we're sort of having a reckoning with our First Nation siblings. Yeah. And the realization of really there was genocide over hundreds of years. Yeah. We have residential schools. We're finding unmarked graves with children in them.
Yeah.
And would there be moral injury? If from your perspective, I'm curious, would there be moral injury and moral distress from all of that process too?
Yeah, I think it happens in a lot of complicated ways. There's the phenomenon of intergenerational trauma, and I think intergenerational moral injury as well. Okay. That you know, if you become aware of previous generation suffering and you've been taught this, you know, great ideal about your country, and you realize, oh, no, it did all these awful things.
Yes.
It's a real reckoning in your own sense of belonging to a nation or a people, or a race even.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of processing. So it can be that kind of intergenerational thing, or and it can also be something that is a complex problem of conflict between groups as they fight for space now in the present. And what does it mean to relate to each other, having this history and having to admit to it? I think, you know, in the United States, we face that in multiple dimensions because of COVID. The first dimension was the clear disproportionate death rates.
Yeah.
And what that said about our not just our history, but the state of the country in relation to those histories. So it's not like it was a passing. It's like still these things are operating now.
Oh, yes, they are.
It's real. It's not just memory, it's real. So there was that. And then there was the murder of George Floyd, which exposed, again, a legal and law enforcement system that was also disproportionately stacked against certain groups of people. And then there was the emergence of all the research and the rise in anti-Asian hate crime. So you know, and most people don't think of Asian Americans as victims of racial hate crimes that much. And now suddenly that's another thing that emerged with COVID that the country is having to come to terms with in the midst of huge political uprisings of white supremacists.
Yeah.
So we're in a pretty sad state right now in the United States, I think, around a lot of this stuff. And part of it is I think that kind of hatred and rigidity and intractability of certain forms of identity that are at the expense of others is actually a symptom of moral injury.
In a system.
In a systemic way,
Yeah.
This is a meaning system that places moral value in one identity over against another identity.
Yeah.
And that kind of animosity as a piece of the structure of identity, is fed by anger, aggression, and fear. And those are all elements of what can emerge in moral injury, in unaddressed moral injury.
Yeah, and I don't mean living next to the United States. You're like, we call you an elephant, we're the mouse in Canada. And, you know, if you roll, but it's like the tension in the United States is so extreme right now.
Yeah.
Between you know, duality of views.
Yeah, and I think it's become a kind of perfect storm of strands of things that originally may not have felt like they were all that connected. That happened with a reaction to the Great Society and civil rights work that really began to change American society quite considerably in the 1960s and 70s. And then you have, and it also, the EP, the Environmental Protection Agency, and other things began to change a lot of things that corporate America had to do. And so I think it began with Reagan, the reaction against that kind of society where corporate America became privileged and unions were destroyed. There was an agenda to destroy unions and people's movements that were fighting for even more equality. And that began to take hold as huge dimensions of American life got privatized into corporate hands. So you have our tax dollars paying for the private administration of prisons and military contractors and the building of toll roads. People had to pay to I mean, there's just utilities, which used to be public.
Yes.
So the privatization into corporate hands of much of American public life together has resulted in rising poverty, and as tax rates went down for corporations and wealthy people. So the Reagan, I call that the Reagan Revolution, was quite successful because it was very systematic about getting people elected who shared their values and then making them pledge to be beholden to those values. And I think that resulted in a large segment of the population whose sense of life expected, the kind of lives they expected, were greatly diminished. And that included the what we call the Rust Belt. All those industrial jobs, union jobs disappeared, right? It's all now service work and retail at minimum wage. And so you can see the white supremacist blocks rising in the country in some of those areas where those declines happened. And so that, I think, the misery, the suffering of that demise of life expectations and meaning and purpose was then channeled, that kind of frustration, humiliation, and anger was channeled into blaming the wrong people, blaming immigrants and people of color for taking away jobs when they didn't take away those jobs. They are just competing for what's left. And then feeding a kind of race hatred out of that. So I think it's almost like Trump was the next logical step in the Reagan Revolution process. But what that meant is that one political party is now trapped in that script. And they're still working to maintain power by denying votes to all the new immigrants and people who were supposedly taking away the jobs. So I don't know how all that's going to come out, but I think we're in terrible straits right now because that agenda's been so successful.
So, like, moral injury is both personal and systemic.
Deeply systemic.
Yes. You can't separate the individual from the system.
Right.
If I hear that right.
That's right. Because meaning systems are relational, and the need for love is relational, and the need to be moral in order to have love is a relational problem, right?
Yeah. And then we have the pandemic on top of that, which would you say that is adding to moral distress and moral injury?
A whole sort of like an iron anvil on
Mm.
top of all the stress that was already brewing in the
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
And it what it did was it just to use a different metaphor, it just threw open and exposed all of
Mm.
those divisions and
Mhm.
suspicions and
Yeah.
strange things perking along that were part of the conflict of American culture. It just made them worse.
Mhm. Mhm. And
Um,
this, yeah, the
uh,
same thing's
and
happening in Canada.
yeah, and of course, part of that was the sort of people think it's sort of like the religious conservative Christian right and everybody else, but I actually think it's more around people who need authoritarian systems to feel safe and
Mhm.
to connect to other people who have um, very little resilience for tolerating ambiguity and
Mm.
being able to make judgments about conflicting pieces of information.
Mhm.
It's just they
Mhm.
want somebody to tell them what to think of it, and then they're going to go with that no matter what, even if it kills them.
In Alberta, we have some of the lowest vaccination rates in Canada. We're more
Wow.
like Texas, and
Yeah.
we
Well,
have,
we have a lot of Texans
yes,
and
yes,
go back and forth to work the oil fields. Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
And then we have a huge anti-masking and anti-vaccination group and sort of freedom. And our hospitals are getting have been overrun, and my fear is nurses and doctors are facing moral distress and moral injury as they have to decide who gets care.
Yeah. Well, and have to put aside how they might
Mhm.
feel about two people,
Yes,
one of whom refused to be vaccinated.
that's right, and they're
Right?
in the hospital now.
And you have to choose between the two, and you can't use the fact that they refuse to be vaccinated as a reason to deny them
Mhm.
care. I mean,
Mhm.
that's an extremely complicated process.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and it's I would not want to have to be in that position. My friends who were doctors in Vietnam say what they're having to do, that
Oh.
triage stuff. They don't train you for that in medical school,
Mhm.
but people
Mhm.
who worked on battlefields in medicine know what that's like, and it's
Mhm.
awful. It's just an awful thing to have to do.
How do we work with this moral injury? Or do we need is there a difference between moral distress and moral injury?
Well, I think moral distress can become severe enough that it becomes moral injury.
Mhm.
But I think we all pretty much as humans experience
Yes.
moral distress from time to time,
Yeah.
maybe not on a daily basis, but
Mhm.
we stumble upon something that we can't make moral sense of and we have to sort it out and we may do something wrong and then we have to figure out how to make amends or fix it if we can possibly and if it can't be fixed we have to figure out how to kind of live with it and integrate it into our lives and most of us
Yeah.
are able to do that and still maintain our relationships with people we care about.
Yep. Yes.
So, but you can accumulate so many of those kinds of things that pile like
Mhm.
you can become so worn out and disgusted about the people who
Mhm.
won't be vaccinated and that you just say, I'm not risking my life anymore for this and walking away from
Mhm.
a career that was your life purpose that
Yep.
you have invested so many years in and you
Yep.
thought you did well and you just leave it. That's a huge break.
Well, they say we're in the great resignation period right now. That was in The Economist.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think in the US, we have a lot of for-profit medicine, and that
Mhm.
the weaknesses of a system like that have been fully exposed by COVID.
Mhm.
I think it's a terrible thing that you would have businesses can only make money when people are sick.
Yes.
They
Yeah.
feed on that. They need
Yeah.
people to be sick, right?
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
is, I think, a fundamentally immoral system.
Yeah.
That's my opinion about a lot of US healthcare. I'm not the only one that feels that way, and more people are beginning to feel that way. But the when it becomes moral injury, when you have someone in an I what you will know when you're experiencing moral injury or somebody else maybe experiencing is that they have a character change.
Hmm.
That they make that may be that they leave a career, that they have a
Yeah.
major break in things that have mattered to them for a very long time in their life. And so it can sometimes it's pop psych is identity crisis.
Sure.
But it is that kind of interior meltdown. And often when people are in that state, they're feeling lots of complicated feelings like shame or guilt or a kind of fury they can't control or humiliation.
Yeah.
And underneath all that is often a lot of grief also, unacknowledged grief. And that's just a huge wad of emotional pain that people, try to push down, but it's moral pain. Because it's the break in your meaning system. It's a crisis in your sense of the rightness of the world. And it's really hard to climb out of that without being able to connect to people you trust. And that's the big hurdle.
Wow.
And with our I've worked a lot with veterans with moral injury, and a lot of them have said to me, I'd never told my therapist stuff I told in my group. Because as useful as mental health services can be for people in a crisis, sometimes they're on the verge of killing themselves, or they're about to overdose or whatever. The mental health service is really important in interventions in those kind of crises. But a mental health relationship with a therapist is a transactional relationship. It's a good transactional. I mean, the point is to deliver services that really help the person. But the fact is that it's not a parallel relationship. It's a one way mostly. The therapist's job is to evaluate, diagnose, and fix. And the client's job is to share their most horrible things, the things that are most interfering in their life. And if they succeed in that relationship, it's good for the client. But after you've borne your soul to this person, you're not allowed to see them again. And moral injury is a relational problem of trust and sustainable relationships. And so while mental health therapy can be an important intervention, it's not the long road to recovery. What you really need is people you can trust, who know who you really are, including all those things that you have suffered and carried, and love you and hang in there with you as one of my veterans friends say, they are with you even when you were hard to be with. And we're willing to sustain some just moral distress themselves from the process, but would hang in there with you to validate the journey you've been on and who you are as a person from the beginning of that journey, not just because you've become better. Right. And that's not an easy process for either side.
No, this is like, in some ways, this is a major, profound, experiential, I have all these words coming up, paradigm shift in, like you said, it's not easy. You have to recover and reconstruct a sense of self after moral
and
injury.
Meaning and connection to the world, that it makes it worth living. People stop living by drinking, using drugs, overworking to exhaustion so they don't have to think about things or feel anything, or taking their own lives.
And this can be any number. I mean, it could be any number of things, the systematic things, as we talked about. It could be climate change. It could be racism, patriarchy, all, like, we just go through all the systematic things, and then it's personal abuse and trauma,
which aggravate all the others. They're co-aggravating. It's bad enough even if you've had this is Jonathan Chase point. Even if you had a wonderful childhood and you're a very stable adult with a good character, still have an experience that just wrecks it. And we all need each other.
You do some really simple, I don't know if group work's the right phrase, but could you talk about that for us?
We had a 2-year pilot program where a team of 8 experts helped me create a program to help veterans with moral injury. And we didn't know how it would, we had some ideas about what we wanted it to do, but we didn't know if it would really do those things. And so we ran a pilot for 2 years out of our Volunteers of America affiliates in New York and Los Angeles. And this is a 50-hour, very intense process. Because it takes that to help people dredge up everything they need to deal with. And then they may not dredge up everything, but enough that they feel a lot better at the end. And so the program wound up being really successful, like really beyond my expectations for positive change. So we expected that before and after, the after would be very high, but 6 months later, life would intervene. And what we discovered was, it's true, 6 months later, life did intervene, and some of their markers for improvement went down, but they never went back to where they were when they started, which was good. But then there were some markers like the propensity to trust, a sense of optimism about life, and a sense of self-worth that kept going up 6 months later. So we thought that was really good. And so when COVID hit and we couldn't meet in person anymore within these groups, we thought, geez, moral injury is going to be a problem everywhere in healthcare. It's not just going to, it's never been just veterans, but the focus had been on veterans. And we realized we needed to shift our focus fast. But we also knew nobody had 50 hours to give. Yeah. And so we thought, what could we do in an hour with people? What could we, if we put them in a small group for an hour and help them share their moral distress, how would that help them keep going? That was really all we were trying to do, was to keep people going during COVID. And so we pulled together our veteran facilitators from our peer. We use peer support work, and we pulled together our veterans who've been facilitators of our program and said, if we only had an hour, what would you pull out of the program that you think might help? And so we took their advice and created a 1-hour online program for small groups of up to 10 people with 1 or 2 facilitators, depending on the size of the group, to give people a chance to just talk about moral distress that they're carrying. And then end on a positive note of affirmation for the fact that they're still alive and still there. Yeah. And so we launched that last June. And for our own employees, because we have 5,000 frontline caregivers in Volunteers America. And then we slowly kept expanding it to all of our employees and then to other people. And eventually last January, we opened it to the public. And so you just go to voa.org/rest, and you can find the program. And we have artists and teachers and students and doctors and nurses and first responders. We have all kinds of people social workers, ministers who use the program. And the hardest part has been getting people to try it. I think number one, it takes an hour. They have to schedule the time and sign up, and it takes an hour, and things intervene. And so, our sign-up rate usually fills up the groups, and then half to 2/3 show up. But that's okay. The ones that show up benefit. But it's just been like pulling teeth to get people to try it once. And I understand why. Yeah, I understand totally why. But we're about to start in a couple of weeks a private area for veterans only.
And so in that hour, what's the process? What's sort of the container for
the container is mindful breathing. We use it to help people listen with their hearts rather than their minds. Because really, when people are coming with moral distress, their capacities for empathy are often reduced because those have been completely depleted, especially in chaplains and healthcare workers who are helping people die a lot. So we use mindful breathing and guided meditation, which is part of that breathing experience, and to help people get in a space where they feel able to share the pain they're carrying. And because they're sharing that pain, sometimes for the first time, that may be the first time they've talked about something that happened that they need to talk
Yeah.
about. They're also, for the first time, hearing themselves, right? They've been trying not to feel it, not to hear it, and suddenly it's there.
Yeah.
So we use the breathing to help people be silent after people speak. So I think that silence is sacred, because the hearing that happens doesn't just happen for the group. It happens for the person who shared, but it also, when the group is listening and feeling the feelings of the person, their sense of empathy comes back. They realize they still have it.
Yes.
And it feels good to be empathetic, right? It's a capacity of love. And so it helps people. That breathing process actually slows down their stress levels. We know that it actually works on your body to reduce cortisol. So we tell them you can use this anytime. So you're learning a skill in the group, but you're using it. And then we guided meditation, and then the facilitators are taught to make sure that if somebody shares anything very intense, that you have the group breathe. And that breathing, that silence is magical.
Wow.
And somehow we are able to do that in an hour. And most of the time, people who need to share get to share. And generally, when you have a group of 10 people, not everybody is in a crisis stage.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
somehow somehow it manages to work out. And just sharing once the difficulty in your heart, and having a group of people say, yes, true. They validate that you feel that way.
Yeah.
That makes you feel more real, more connected to us, right?
Yes.
So then at the end, there's an affirmation. People are just asked to say one thing they're grateful for, or one, thing that's positive about themselves. It's up to the facilitators which question they use. But so then people can remember that. They can leave and say, yeah, this is something I'm grateful for. And for often they say, I'm just grateful for the group to have been here for me today. That kind of. And somehow it seems to do enough in an hour that people return when they need it. And the surveys we ask people to fill out at the end, ask them to say, I felt this way when I came in, now I feel. And generally people have a positive experience. And even if they've only done it once, I've heard people say, oh, I tried that once, it was really helpful. So well, come back, you can come back anytime. So that was what we tried to do during COVID, was just make it possible for our employees to hang in there, and for others as well. And we now have clients that have we've prepared special programs for their, like a nurse, graduate nurses for one healthcare company, and for retired people who've been victims of fraud.
In some ways, that sounds really easy.
Well, it is at one level.
Yes.
The hard, we have really good facilitators. We've used the veterans that were in our program who are highly seasoned facilitators, and they're now trainers for new facilitators. But the new facilitators have been through the program, so that's a big advantage because they know what it is. And so. And we have a system way we do the trainings, including apprenticing with one of our trainers for your first few groups, so you feel confident doing it, and you could run it on yourself by yourself if you had to. So that part is not the hard part. The hard part is getting people to use it.
Yeah. So do I hear you right that you're saying that part of the way that we can reintegrate and heal from moral distress and injury is by being listened to and by feeling deeply held in trust, a community of trust?
Yeah. Which is why we have this course for ministers. We think this is a natural for religious groups and congregations if people understand what moral distress and moral injury are, and could learn this kind of quality of deep listening. It's often as a spiritual care provider, you're often trained to pray or to offer something to the person rather than silence.
Yes.
Right. And often people think you're supposed to give them advice.
Yes.
And I think that that can actually suppress what someone needs to let go of because it someone else is speaking and it silences them.
And
Um,
does moral injury, from your perspective, is there a quality that there is this silencing sometimes with moral injury?
Well, with moral injury, one of the most important problems with it is that you don't trust anybody anymore because your immune system doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And you also feel so terrible that you don't want anybody to know how you feel because they might not want to be around you or love you again.
Yeah.
So there's the self-silencing that goes on around mistrust and shame and those other things. And so you wind up in what one veteran called existential solitary confinement.
Wow.
And to break that solitary confinement is a crucial thing. And to share some of the worst things you've done or experienced, you need someone you can trust not to judge you.
Yeah.
Not to be evaluating you.
Well, that's hard to find these days, isn't it?
Yeah, it's basically
like you're saying,
what a good friendship is, right?
it is. And I do agree with you. Nothing wrong with counseling, therapists, all that, but it is transactional.
Yes,
Like,
and it can be quite, I mean, if I have somebody who's suicidal, I'm not experienced enough as a clinician. I'm not a clinician, so I don't, I would feel much more comfortable with somebody else trained in that could handle those things.
Yeah.
So and in fact, all our peer specialists, all our facilitators are backed up by a clinician, so they know they don't have to handle something that they don't know what to do with.
That's right.
But we have had veterans go through our program. One who had one we know of who told us he had a dissociative personality disorder. He did fine. The group, when he shared a sort of outrageous story from childhood that, if you were assessing it for that validity, didn't sound plausible at all. The group didn't go there. They just said, "Oh, I just so, yeah, I can understand how you felt that way." They just went with his feelings.
Yeah.
And so he felt very validated in the group. He said it was the best he'd ever been treated in his life by other people. And so even then, this is a person with a pretty serious psychiatric diagnosis who managed to go through the group, and I don't think we fixed his diagnosis. It was just that he had a really positive experience, so he felt better about himself at the end. He still had his conspiracy theories and other things going on. But he was smart and funny, and he was able to relate to people in the group, so he did all right. And we've had plenty of people who've been in psychiatric care or seeing a therapist who've come to our group for the veterans and benefited. And they often will say, "Oh, I would never have told this to my therapist." But then they go back to therapy and they're better off with a kind of self-knowledge. One of them actually went back to her psychiatrist with a list of things she needed help with from her psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist said to her, "Thank you for this. I'm glad the group was helpful to you. This list will make me a better psychiatrist. Now I really know how to help you." Right? So we see what we're doing, and not as competing with that, but that we can do some things that therapy can't do and can help.
What's so interesting as you explain this, the groups aren't about fixing or commenting or saying you're right or wrong. It's like this, I don't know if you ever explain, being held to be truly listened to is to be truly loved in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. And most of us don't listen well to ourselves.
Yeah.
This is the Buddhist principle that you're not your thoughts and you're not your feelings, but we are very attached to our experiences and our feelings and our evaluations and our stories. So we're very attached to that thing in our brains that holds all of those things, our memories and all of that. And in Buddhism, there is the observer who holds those things. And becoming aware of the observer makes you able to let those things flow through you as part of who you are, but not be latched onto them and attached to them which is the Buddhist definition of freedom, is non-attachment, right?
Yeah.
And it's not annihilation of yourself or the disvaluing of those things, but understanding that all of those things are fleeting.
Yes.
And so you don't have to become attached to your pain or attached to a particular story. They just become part of the flow of your life. And that that flow, that sense, means that you actually attend to your thoughts and feelings in a way that you can let them go. And that's very different from thinking that you are your thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
And that's a quality of listening to yourself, of that quiet, being able to quiet all of those things to actually be present to yourself in this actual moment, in this flesh, at this time. And that's what I think the breathing helps with. Because when you bring, the other thing Buddhists know is that all of that breathing and stuff is so much easier in a group. It's because your body's, there's something that happens in the group that it makes it much easier to do. Somebody's counting for you. You don't have to do all of it yourself. And if you can get people to breathe enough, they will become much more present in their body and in the moment. They are less attached to all that stuff. And that's just how you listen to yourself and to others.
Is listening one of the keys to help have systematic change? Because we have this perpetual distress and injury happening over generations.
Yeah.
How do we evolve and step out of this from your perspective?
Well,
and find hope and healing and resiliency in all of this?
So I don't think there's one solution, but I do think that one thing that sometimes happens is that when a previous, this is a theory that a woman who studied the literature of children of the Holocaust arrived at, that sometimes when you belong to a generation in which the generation before you or previous generations suffered atrocities, I mean, things that are unimaginably horrible.
Yeah.
And then you're a child of that it can be really difficult for you to feel any sense of worth in your own life because you didn't suffer like that. And it can make you feel like your life is too easy or trivial somehow. That this other thing is so huge that it just sort of washes over the next generation, even though they didn't suffer it.
Yeah.
And so as a child of that process, you can just become traumatized. You can take it on as if it were your own thing, and it dominates your life and your agenda in a way that you become very attached to the trauma itself as making meaning of your life.
Yeah.
And the woman who developed this thing, Marianne Hirsch, she herself was a child of Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
So she has a personal investment in this understanding what she calls post-memory. She calls this taking on a post-memory. And she says it can just erase a person's life as their own life. And when that happens, or if the generation that follows the atrocity has their own forms of trauma, then they all get mixed together.
Yeah.
And it keeps re-traumatizing generations by being carried over in that way.
Yeah.
So I think that the struggle is to honor that honor the survivors of atrocity in a way that doesn't reproduce it in the next generation, and yet at the same time isn't lost as information and wisdom that's historical and important for how the society lives forward and doesn't reproduce it.
Yes.
And that's a fine distinction. It's the distinction between inherited trauma and historical memory, and loving those who came before while also realizing this is not the life I now have, but I can use a life I now have.
Yes.
To honor those traditions without reproducing the trauma.
Yeah.
And dealing with maybe the legacy of that trauma that's Like, you still got to deal with anti-Semitism. You
Yeah.
still have to deal with some of those things, but your own life may not be threatened in the same way. So you have power to get elected to Congress or to do other things to make the change, right?
Yes. Yes.
Then sort of stewing in the trauma.
And being stuck there.
Being stuck there. And that's a subtle thing, because you don't want to tell people who are activists and working that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
But I think we do need to attend to the forms of pain we carry.
Yes. We all carry our own pain. It's
and
a messy life.
Yeah. And the more we work to end that kind of suffering, the better and more effective, I think, change agents we become. As we're not nearly so easy to throw off balance, and we have a lifelong ability to keep at it with all the setbacks involved without just folding or becoming cynical. That's the danger of moral injury, is you become cynical.
So as we come to the close here, is there anything you want for those of us listening, like to really know, or any final wisdom, or or something your heart wants to say around this all?
I think we at least in the US, think way too much in terms of individual freedom and the individual as the primary unit of society. And so we do not attend to good relationships. We do not attend to how to help families and communities in any kind of adequate way. We pay no attention to childcare because it seems like an individual problem, apparently, when in fact, well-raised children are a major gift to society, and a beleaguered, poor, and struggling parent is struggling with so many things, and we don't offer any support for that sort of thing. So I think, and there are societies in which attention to the collective and the whole are much stronger in their value systems. And I think Canada actually is better at that than the US. That if we don't shift our sense of where value lies away from individual liberty, I think individual liberty is relative. I think love is an absolute. That it would help us do better for each other if we stop thinking so much about our own well-being and think about our well-being as it's like we talk about self-care. Well, self-care isn't really self-care. Care of ourselves is how we also are well in relation to others.
I really appreciate that. As a former biologist, it speaks to the interdependence of this little blue planet, this dot in space. I mean, it's all relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like when William Shatner came off of this, he was weeping at the sense of this blue, that, if everybody could just see what I saw, this whole, and there are, and I actually think that spiritual and religious systems do some of that work for us, but they've also, at least in the US, are sort of ossified in 500-year-old forms of ritual. I think it's time for maybe better climate change and community-oriented forms of ritual that attend to what's really happening now.
What sparked your curiosity in this episode? Do you sense a resiliency that was hidden before? From the conversation, where is hope leading you? If you are enjoying this podcast, please subscribe, consider rating it, and sharing it with family and friends. This podcast is produced by McKillop United Church. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the generosity of all of our donors. If you want to support this podcast, go to patreon.com or mckillopunited.ca/donate. Peace and blessings to you.